Bowman's Notes, written in a cramped scrawl, covering every inch of the page at every angle in between sketches and diagrams. A handful of graveyard dirt, aged, 2 pinches of brass shavings, preferably from a thing that used to create other things, a drop of essence of customary, a drop of essence of mugwort, a piece of birch root, 3 copper coins, an amethyst, femur of a cotton-tailed rabbit, encased in a red flannel or hardened gourd depending on application. Must be very specific about incantations, prayers, or other scripture placed in the conjure. This one in particular is very potent, and an incorrect script or wrong attitude can mean life or death. Here, the handwriting changes significantly.
We found a strange plant near the coast. Small black petals poking out through the snow. It smells like rot. Initial tests indicate that it could be a virulent toxin.
The following sentence is crossed out.
The host is finding more methods to wrench control away from us. He asks us for this. Now he's backing out? Stop writing, you fool. He'll see this. Let him see it then.
Ever since the feast, it's been hard to control my thoughts, to focus. It's obvious something happened. The Loire aren't supposed to hang about as long as this. Regardless, the land here is much more different than I expected. The soil is rocky. Not many trees or plants, other than the grass, bushes, and a handful of indigenous wildflowers. Yes, I inspected an odd black variant. It has many more properties than just its toxicity. Other than that, many of the roots here seem lifeless. I will continue to observe and document. I've gotten a number of unusual looks since entering the school grounds. I suppose they weren't expecting to see someone like me here. Despite what the invitation I received insisted, I have maintained the proper etiquette when addressing them. I don't fight this war with words and weapons. Most of the students and teachers here have been civil enough, beside the odd glances and liberal use of harsh names. But I didn't expect much more. I just hope it won't get in the way of my research. The headman is powerful. He conjured a display of light and fire like I've never seen before, and without any conjure tools or physical elements that I could see. I'll need to speak with him. Low John root properties, used to draw luck and protection, when combined in the right conjure can help guarantee success in specific endeavors. When ingested through tea or essence infusion, it can enhance sense and mental ability. Titus Bowman.
Chapter 4. Victor Corveil laid motionless atop his small bed in the small bedroom of his dorm, his eyes fixed and unblinking on the hollow, pale yellow holes of hatred staring down at him, inches from his face. His chest contracted under the impossible weight of the anorexic creature that sat crouched there. His breaths were short and ragged. Sweat dripped down his brow and burned his scars and eyes. The ghost's body mimed his breathing, yet no sound escaped its gaping maw. Seconds stretched into minutes, stretched into hours, and into an eternity. He felt the broken fingernails of the creature digging into his skin, clinging onto him for life. Finally, a knock sounded at his door. His ghost turned its head and then was gone in the blink of an eye. Corveil gasped for breath, rolling over off the bed and dry heaving on the floor. This wasn't the first time the ghost had kept him up like this, paralyzed, terrified. But it was certainly the worst. He lay face down on the ground for a while before a second series of knocks beat against the thick oak door.
"Coming!"
he croaked. He lifted himself with his forearms, climbed the side of the bed, and gained solid footing, then approached the door. He pulled the door open to reveal Rupert standing there, with his hand raised, ready to knock.
"Ah, Mr. Corveil, good morning to you,"
the portly man said.
"Rupert,"
Corveil responded.
"I realized that I hadn't informed you of the daily school schedule. Breakfast is served in the dining hall every morning at 8 a.m.
He checked his watch. which is 15 minutes from now. There is also a written schedule attached to my office door downstairs with all other meal and event times posted," he said cheerfully.
"Thanks,"
Corveil said, rubbing his eyes. "Well then, I'll leave you to prepare for the day. If you have any other questions, you know where to find me." Rupert retreated down the hall. Corveil closed the door behind him and leaned his back against it, sliding down to the floor. He let his breath run away from him again, hyperventilating. He fought to regain composure and was eventually able to settle himself down. He decided that getting breakfast would be a good idea, and it would help keep his mind off of the night's terrors. He dressed and headed down through the dormitory building. He reached the main entrance and saw Howard standing in the doorway, blocking someone from entering and speaking in a raised and harsh voice.
"I was told to come to Rook's Lair to find a room,"
the man on the other side of the door said.
"And I told you there must be a mistake, boy,"
Howard responded.
"It's Doctor, actually."
Howard's eyes took on a dangerous cast.
"Doctor, is it? Whatever you like, Doctor,"
he said with pure disgust. Rupert exited his office and approached Howard.
"Now, Howard, if the staff sent him here, then don't you think—"
"I will not allow this old man to disgrace Oliver Rook's good name. Might I suggest Seeley's Dray?"
Howard cut in.
"Look, I am the head of this house, and if I—"
"And I am a professor here, who also knows the kind of company you keep on Thursday nights. So unless you want the headmaster to know that information as well, I suggest you turn tail and go back into hiding in your office, Rupert," he said coldly.
Much to Corveil's surprise, Rupert's head fell, and he did as Howard told him. Then Howard turned back to the man on the other side of the door, who was still obscured from Corveil's view.
"Now, Doctor, why don't you scamper off to where you belong, yes?"
"Yes,"
came the reply from the other side.
"Yes, what?"
Howard insisted.
"Yes, Professor."
Corveil crossed the foyer and approached the door in time to see the man on the other side turn around, replacing his rough brown cap atop his head. He was African. A spike of rage welled up inside Corveil. Howard turned around to face him.
Corveil, the headmaster was—"
Corveil didn't let him finish before pushing past him through the door and shoving Howard to the side way harder than he would have needed to pass.
"The headmaster wanted to see you,"
he called out from the door, disdain poisoning his tone. Corveil knew he shouldn't have treated a professor in that way, whether interim or otherwise. But at this point, he didn't care. He jogged across the dew-dampened cobblestones to catch up with the man who was walking towards Seeley's Dray. He wore a dark brown vest over a worn white shirt. His tan pants were stained with dirt. A thick brown messenger bag was slung around his shoulder, and he had various pouches and bags tied around his belt at his waist, and also to the straps of the bag itself.
"Mister!"
Corveil called out when he was merely steps away from him. The man turned around, a look of surprise on his face. He quickly reached up and removed his hat, and bowed his head slightly.
"Cap'n,"
he responded hesitantly. Corveil reached out his left hand.
"The name's Corveil."
The man reluctantly lifted his head and met his eyes with a skeptical glance. After a moment, he took his hand and shook it awkwardly with his own left hand.
"Bowman. Titus Bowman. And I don't need your pity, Mr. Corveil."
With that, he replaced his cap once again and turned around, walking towards the dorm. Corveil stood there in the center of the courtyard for a few moments, dumbfounded. The air was warmer than it was the previous day, and no rain fell from the gray, overcast sky. A thin fog stretched across the campus, giving the whole scene an ethereal feeling. He made his way into the dining hall. Unlike the rest of the buildings he had been inside of, The dining hall had a relatively low ceiling, but the hall stretched long into the distance so that it could accommodate all the students in rows of long wooden tables with deep red tablecloths draped over them. He tried to find a secluded place to sit, but a bundle of orange hair caught his attention before he could make it far. This Pride girl had stood up from where she was towards the middle of one of the rows and was waving her arm rigorously, motioning for Corveil to come. He rolled his eyes. Yes, this was the only student he had met thus far other than Titus, but he was also not looking for the pity invitation this girl was clearly offering him. He found her exuberant energy annoying, but before he could think of a way out of the situation, he found himself walking towards the table. A broad smile stretched across her face as he grew closer. He plopped down in the seat beside her with an audible sigh. Her smile faded slightly.
"Glad to see how excited you are to see me," she said lightly.
"Apologies, I had a rough night," he said. That same look of pity resurfaced.
"I don't think we were properly introduced yesterday," she said. "I'm Cynthia Pride."
"Victor Corveil."
"A pleasure, Victor Corveil."
The broad smile appeared again, lightening up the room. It irritated Corveil. After all he had seen and been through, he found such displays of joy nauseating. Not that it was insincere, just too innocent and ignorant to the horrors of the world. A small dinner bell rang at the far corner, and a crowd of students rose from their seats in unison. Cynthia stood as well and grabbed his arm, pulling him up.
"You have to try the bacon and eggs," she said to him, excited.
Bacon and eggs for breakfast, he thought to himself, confused. He was used to eating a light breakfast, nothing more than coffee and some rolls. The idea of such a heavy breakfast intrigued him. He followed her to the queue which had formed at the kitchen counter. Sure enough, there was a wide spread of bacon, eggs, and sausage, all prepared in dozens of different ways. After a brief period of overwhelmed hesitation, he dug in and loaded up his plate. The two of them returned to their seats, plates overflowing with delicious food. It may have been the biggest breakfast Corveil had ever eaten, and he enjoyed every bit of it. Eating with his left hand still proved difficult for him. He had to move to Cynthia's left side to prevent from constantly bumping arms with her, which she seemed to find morbidly hilarious.
"So you're from Ireland?"
he asked within the silence between bites.
"Aye, this was actually my first time leaving the island,"
she said once she had finished chewing.
"Is it strange?"
he asked.
"Not as strange as I thought it would be. Gloomcleft shares a lot of similarities with home, though it's a bit colder. I would guess the rest of the country is quite different."
"Yes," he replied.
"Especially out west. It's like a whole different world." "Cowboys?"
she shouted, that same bright smile taking up permanent residence on her face. Corveil couldn't help but chuckle, which drove a spike of pain through the scars on his face. He winced, but his smile remained as he replied.
"Yes, cowboys, though I don't think there are as many of them left as some of the stories might suggest. My father brought back a number of stories from his travels when I was a kid. The Virginian was my favorite."
Corveil looked at her strangely, his fork halfway to his mouth.
"That's a bit of a violent book for a little girl to be reading, isn't it?"
Her cheeks flushed.
"Well, me father read it to me. I suppose he may have left out some parts."
Corveil chuckled and winced again, and then carried on eating.
"Where are you from?"
she asked.
"I grew up here in Salem, right near the shore."
Her face grew solemn at the mention of Salem, then continued eating.
"I take it you've heard of Salem?"
he asked.
"I've heard of the trials. They had been happening all over the world, of course, but few became as notorious as the ones here."
Corveil set his fork down, having finished most of his meal.
"Speaking of witches and magic," he said, "what do you think of this place? Before Lucien's little display."
You seem to know what was going on. Her bright smile returned. Well, of course I know what's going on. I'm a Banjri and he's the Dagda. Corveil stared at her for a moment. Yeah, I don't know what any of those words mean. I'm a Banjri. I guess you would call me a witch, though we don't call it witchcraft where I'm from. To say that Corveil was skeptical would be an understatement. He had actually begun to like this girl, despite her eccentricities, but claiming to be a witch was testing the limits of what he would put up with. You're not gonna turn me into a frog or something, are you? He joked. No, but maybe a swan, she said seriously. His smile lowered slightly. And what is a Daga? Dagda, she corrected. He was one of the Tua Dadanan, an ancient god and chieftain of my people. Corveil couldn't help but roll his eyes and let out an audible sigh. Cynthia did not appreciate this. Scoff all you want, Victor Corveil. The gods don't care whether you believe in them or not, she said with a look of pain on her face as she stood up. She looked towards him intently, her bright green eyes nearly at the brink of tears, drilling into his own. She continued to stare, as if waiting for an apology. Regrettably, he didn't give one, and she stormed out of the room, provoking a flood of strange looks and glances at both she and him. He knew he shouldn't have asked her about herself and then scoffed at the answer she gave to him as he had, but he couldn't help it. And after all, it wasn't his fault that she believed in fairy tales. A foot landed loudly on the chair next to him where Cynthia had sat. He looked at it and then followed the long leg up to the sheik's face that he had seen the day before. Their intense and haughty stare bored into Corveil's soul. Come along, heartbreaker, he said in a lighter voice than Corveil would have expected, and in a posh English accent laced with boredom. The headmaster wants to see you, and apparently I'm his errand boy now, he said distastefully, rolling his dark eyes. I would absolutely hate to keep him waiting. The sarcasm-drenched words were not lost on Corveil. He stood up as the sheik's foot slid off the chair, and then he followed him out of the dining hall. The sheik was the same height as Corveil, but he had a hard time keeping up with their long stride. Corveil jogged up beside them. I never got your name, he said. Keen, was all they said in response. I'm Victor. Yes, I know who you are, Keen interrupted, halting their brief conversation in its tracks. Keen led Corveil to Leviathan Hall and into its bowels, through the dark and dusty halls, past classrooms where teachers were preparing their day's lessons. They climbed up several flights of stairs and into what Corveil assumed was the central tower of the large building. Keen opened a door for Corveil to enter. The room opened up wide to swallow him. It was oval and lined by tall bookshelves in front of deep red velvet walls. A ladder hung from a rail at the top of the nearest shelf. Two mirrored staircases rounded the back wall up to a railed-off loft. In the center of the room was a large dark oak writing desk, and behind it sat Lucien. A pair of cheaters sat on his face as he scanned several stacks of paper sprawled out before him.
Ah, come in,
he said to both of them, motioning for them to approach.
I take it you've already introduced yourself.
Something like that, Corveil responded. Keen rolled his eyes.
Well, at the risk of being redundant and for the sake of being thorough, this is Keen Serpin, the last direct descendant of Arthur Serpin, one of Antumbra's founders.
Keen sat down in a small wooden chair in front of Lucien and tossed his feet up on his desk. Lucien shot him a quick glance.
Despite this being his first year as well, he is very knowledgeable about our art and history, so I have asked him to be your guide of sorts. Or perhaps tutor is a better word.
More like nanny, Keen interjected. Lucien looked at Keen coldly.
He, of course, has enthusiastically agreed.
Keen raised his hand in a fist and pumped it in the air mockingly, saying, Yay, dryly. Lucian's glare turned to ice, but he continued.
I'm sure he will be an invaluable tool in your investigation. Now, unless you have any further questions for me at this time, I have quite the busy day of paperwork ahead of me,
he said with a smile, and pushed Keen's feet swiftly off the table without a glance towards him. Thanks, Lucian, Corveil said, before turning to exit. Keen hopped up and tailed behind him.
One more thing, Corveil,
Lucian said right before they reached the door. Corveil stopped and turned around to face him. Yeah?
I know Howard can be insufferable at times, but try not to let him provoke you,
he said sympathetically. He was being cruel to a student, Corveil defiantly said.
Was that student?
It shouldn't matter who the student was. Lucian lifted his hand slightly and nodded in concession.
Of course. I will speak with Howard, though I would ask that you attempt to show him some modicum of respect.
With all due respect, my respect has to be earned. Lucian smiled softly and nodded slightly again.
That will be all, Corveil,
he said. Then Corveil and Keen exited the study.